This is the third installment in our series of interviews with contributors to the 2025 book, Liberal Emancipation, Explorations in Political and Social Economy. In this interview, EFI Vice President of Scholarly Research, Bill Glod, talks with economist Nathan Goodman about his chapter, A Radical Liberal Approach to LGBTQ Emancipation, and what liberals and leftists can learn from each other.
Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Nathan Goodman, who recently authored a chapter on LGBTQ emancipation in the collected volume Liberal Emancipation, edited by Michaela Novak and published by Palgrave Macmillan. Nathan Goodman is a senior fellow at the F.A. Hyatt Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He earned his PhD in economics at George Mason University and worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the Program on the Foundations of the Market Economy at New York University. Dr. Goodman's research focuses on border militarization, state violence, civil liberties, self-governance, and social movements. His research has been published in various peer-reviewed journals, including the European Economic Review, Constitutional Political Economy, Public Choice, the Journal of Institutional Economics, and the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. He blogs on Substack at Guns, Guards, and Governance, and in addition to his professional and academic work, he spent many years advocating individualist anarchism in his writings at the Center for a Stateless Society. He is also a member of the board of the Fully Informed Jury Association, which educates the public on the right to trial by jury and jury nullification. Welcome, Dr. Goodman.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill.
If there's one takeaway you hope a general reader can get from your chapter, what would that be?
So I guess the big takeaway would be that liberal societies have been enormously important in expanding the freedom of LGBTQ people, but that there's still more that can be done to expand that freedom, and that we can learn from people on the radical left who have a less favorable view of this progress narrative than I do.
Okay. So you talk some about the history of the LGBT movement. Economically free and liberal societies, you claim, provide many more spaces than less liberal societies for marginalized groups like LGBT people. So you mentioned the example of Tony Loria. I don't know if I have the pronunciation of his name right, but he was not the most savory person, but in an authoritarian regime, he's somebody who might get paid by the government to oppress those perceived as threats. But in the liberal one, he was paid by his LGBT clients, his customers, to run the Stonewall Inn. So why do radical critics of liberalism often underappreciate ways in which markets and civil society can actually provide incentives for otherwise unsavory actors like Tony to be neutral or even pro-social rather than destructive?
Yeah, absolutely. So the case of Tony Loria and the Stonewall Inn really illustrates how markets can create social spaces for members of marginalized communities to meet one another, form community, and build the kinds of solidaristic social ties and space for self-expression that might otherwise be repressed. And so to understand this, it's worth looking at the history of the Stonewall Inn. So before Tony Loria, who was a mobster, a member of the mafia, purchased the Stonewall Inn, the Stonewall Inn was a failing business, a basic sort of bar and grill that was serving mainstream heteronormative audiences, right? And wasn't making profits. And what happens in a relatively free market society when a firm isn't making profits? Well, that means that the current owners have to either adjust their production plans to try and make their business more profitable, or they may have to sell their existing assets to people who have an idea of how to use them more productively and in a manner that will make more profits. Now, Tony Loria was one such entrepreneur. He was alert to a profit opportunity to purchase the Stonewall Inn and pivot towards serving a new clientele. And of course, LGBT people at this time, we're talking, 1950s, 1960s, right, were a very underserved audience because they were heavily stigmatized, they were criminalized in various ways. And of course, when you're serving a criminalized population, who's going to have a comparative advantage in doing that? Well, someone who's already adept at evading and bribing law enforcement, such as a member of the mob, is likely to be someone with a comparative advantage in that type of activity. And so Tony Lauria purchases the Stonewall Inn and starts to run it as a private bottle club and a gay bar, right? Now, running it as a private bottle club enables you to get around some of the regulations that would ordinarily suppress this type of activity. And so he's engaged in a type of evasive entrepreneurship. Now, this isn't because the mafia was, so socially progressive and cared so much about LGBTQ liberation, right? In addition to running this bar, they were blackmailing some of their wealthier clients because doing so would enable them to get additional revenue, and because outing people was, something that would really mess up their lives, and they knew that, and so they were able to use that to take advantage of some of their clients. But it's still the case that by creating this social space, Tony Lauria wound up playing a big role in setting in motion a lot of key features of the LGBTQ civil rights movement in the United States, right? And so the way I put this sometimes is that, to paraphrase Adam Smith, it is not from benevolence of the mafia that we expect our gay bar, but from their regard to their own self-interest. And so I think that this feature of markets, that it generates a set of profit opportunities that guide people towards engaging in cooperative and mutually beneficial activity with people, including people they might otherwise stigmatize, gets neglected by some people, because if you look at any particular snapshot in time of a market, you're also going to see some amount of unsavory activity, right? So, for instance, people interacting in the labor market might find, especially marginalized people, might find instances where they're discriminated against by employers, right? Or they might find themselves in a situation where they're applying to rent an apartment and they find it difficult to find housing, right? Like, people experience a lot of genuine social struggles within the economic and commercial arena. And so the fact that people experience these genuine social struggles, the fact that they experience genuine power relations, right? The power of a boss over a worker, the power of a landlord over a tenant, and so on, that means that many people are understandably suspicious of markets. And so my claim is not that markets are always perfect, or that markets are always in a state of equilibrium, or that no discrimination or dominion occurs in actually existing markets. My claim is more modest. My claim is that liberal market orders enable experimentation, entrepreneurship, and discovery that generates a tendency to bring people together in peaceful, mutually beneficial, voluntary, and cooperative interactions, and to discover ways to better serve each other and to better interact across social difference. And I think that's true of other aspects of liberal societies as well, right? The United States government has been deeply imperfect on issues of LGBTQ rights over the years, but things like the appellate court system upholding the First Amendment rights of gay people to operate magazines that the government tried to suppress, like One Magazine, or court cases like Lawrence v. Texas, which interpreted 14th Amendment rights and rights to privacy as implying that sodomy laws were a violation of constitutional limits on government. This indicates that a set of liberal institutions, whether that's markets or a system of constitutional checks and balances characterized by some amount of the rule of law and a set of courts that can constrain the operations of legislators and executive agencies, that these can generate a set of safeguards for the rights of those who are vulnerable and marginalized in society. And again, I think a lot of people underestimate this because we also do see very real failures of the constitutional system, right? Right now, ICE is violating numerous court orders. So it's understandable for people to look at this and say, well, okay, well, you say there's this liberal notion of the rule of law, but it's a sham. The police can violate it in practice, right? Or you say the courts can protect us, but government agents who exercise state violence often have these privileges of qualified immunity that immunize them from tort liability. And I grant all of that, right? Actually existing liberal systems are deeply imperfect. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement, which is part of the point I try and make in this chapter. But I think in order to understand how we've had the social progress that we have seen and how we can have more social progress, it's important to understand some of the error-correcting features of existing liberal systems and how we can make institutional changes that will enable us to take advantage of more benefits of these error-correcting tendencies rather than fewer. And I think some critics of liberalism instead say, okay, I see these injustices, and if we were to level all existing institutions, or to have my vanguard party take power, or to engage in certain types of direct action that defy a set of institutions that accord with liberal rights, right, then I could correct those injustices. And in principle, maybe you could, but you also might wind up eroding a set of institutions that enable us to better serve the interests of marginalized people. And you might create new forms of concentrated power that would generate even more dysfunctions. And so my claim is not that liberalism doesn't have flaws and that it can't be improved, but rather that we need to understand what's working right in liberalism in order to correct what's not working so well.
Great. That kind of anticipates some of the questions I also had, but maybe we could dive a little deeper on this matter. So as liberals, we're opposed to victimless crimes. At least I am. I think you are too. You seem to cite Dean Spade, the author Dean Spade, approvingly by claiming that things like policing, imprisonment, and immigration enforcement as such are inherently violent activities. So does this mean that they are inherently wrongful too? And if so, how would we deal with violent criminals in your preferred world?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And the way I sort of think about this is as follows. One, violence is something that we should talk about in a relatively general way to include instances of violent actions that we might be inclined to think are justified, right? So suppose someone's trying to murder you and you pull a gun from your holster and shoot them in self-defense. It seems as though you've committed a violent act, but you've committed a justified act of violence in that case. It would seem weird and euphemistic to say, well, it wasn't violence because it was justified. No violence took place here today. That seems mistaken. Instead, what we would say is, yeah, you violently responded in self-defense, and that was justified violence, right? And so I think that the way to think about this is that policing, imprisonment, and immigration enforcement always involve violence, right? Anytime you arrest somebody, whether they're a nonviolent drug offender or a petty thief or a murderer or a rapist, this involves a police officer exercising force or the threat of force in order to put someone in some type of metal constraints, take them into a car, lock them in a cage, and if they were to try to leave the cage without permission, the guards would use physical force to stop them. Physical force up to and including lethal force in some cases, right? And so that is the threat of physical violence in order to achieve an outcome, right? And the question is just, is that justified physical violence or is it unjustified physical violence? And the way I look at this on an ethical level is that there's a moral presumption against violence. And so we can think of some cases where that physical violence is clearly unjustified. And you gave the example of victimless crimes, and I'm with you there, right? If somebody is doing something that only harms themselves, that involves a decision about what they're doing with their own body and doesn't involve interfering with the body or property of another person, then that's not a justified instance of a justified case for using violence to intervene upon them, right? And then at the other extreme, we can say, all right, someone is directly about to commit a murder, directly about to commit a rape. It seems clear that in that case, we can use physical violence up to and including lethal force in defense of yourself or others to stop that action. And then in the middle, we have a bunch of things that are fuzzier, right? So then we need to consider things like proportionality, things like what is the most just way to use violence? Have we exceeded the just scope of violence, right? So suppose someone commits a violent action at one point in time, and then we've responded with physical force. What can we do after sort of that violent action has occurred in order to constrain them, right? So when they're not actively pursuing a plan to kill another person, what may we legitimately do to them? And so one view might be we may legitimately imprison them if we have gone through a process of trial by jury. And we may legitimately imprison them pre-trial in order to protect the public prior to this. And this is a plausible view, right? So I'm not saying it's a totally implausible view and that all state violence carried out in the criminal justice system is obviously wrong. But this sort of seemingly best case scenario for the exercise of state violence, I want to argue that it has some problems that might be underrated by people within our society. So one problem with imprisonment is that in order to maintain a prison system, you need to have a set of public employees who, as a condition of their job, have pretty strong discretionary power over a class of prisoners, right? Over a broad group of prisoners, right? So a prison guard might be pretty hard to hold accountable if they engage in the types of activities towards prisoners that we think we need prisons to prevent prisoners from doing towards other people, right? So a prison guard might find it relatively easy to get away with beating a prisoner, torturing a prisoner, raping a prisoner. And in fact, at least in the US system, they often do find it relatively easy to get away with that because the prisoners operate under the thumb of these guards, right? They are operating in conditions where they have relatively limited ability to get in touch with people on the outside to share their stories. They do have some ability, right? Like there's mail to prisoners, there's visitation rights and so on, but they have some limits on their ability to do that. And guards exercise a lot of discretionary power over them. So that creates a dangerous situation. So we might want to ask the question, is there a way to attempt to respond coercively to the types of violent crimes that need a coercive response without creating that type of power relationship? And likewise with policing, right? So existing police have qualified immunity, they have the power to strip search people, they have the power to, arrest people and stop people. So can we avoid that while having some way to coercively respond to the type of violent coercion that we need some coercive response to? And so the type of view that I'm inclined to argue for is not necessarily a fixed institutional prescription of this is the blueprint for the exact type of justice system I want to see, so much as a set of questions about, can we remove some of the monopoly privileges that state actors have? Can we create a situation where rather than these state actors being a privileged caste that has a monopoly on the use of force, might there be a way to open up more polycentricity, more contestation, more freedom of entry and exit, more ability for people to disassociate from one set of governing authorities and associate with another set of governing authorities? Can we hold those who exercise these coercive prerogatives to account in a manner that means that they are liable under rules of property, contract, consent, and tort, right? And are there ways that sometimes we could rely on things other than coercive violence in cases that seem like they might need coercive violence? So could reputation mechanisms and ostracism play a bigger role than we might at first think? Might there be cases where rather than thinking of things in terms of a crime where the harm was to the state, and we had a case called people versus insert name of person who has done a wrong, we instead have the victim versus the offender so that we can get restitution or restoration of the status quo ante, right? That seems like it might be more beneficial to the victim, and it might be something that puts the focus on the rights violation and therefore removes the likelihood of the state declaring a set of victimless crimes, right? Because if you need there to be a victim in order for there to be a tort, that means that you're not going to have under tort law a set of victimless offenses the way you do under existing criminal law. We might ask questions about, are there things that we can do prior to crimes taking place that reduce the likelihood of crimes? And some of those things do involve the criminal justice system, right? There's a lot of evidence within economics that more police on the street deters crime, right? But there's also evidence from, for instance, the work of Jane Jacobs that more eyes on the street in general deters crime. So could we develop communities where there's, a robust civic culture, people are actively, engaged in their neighborhoods, and does that help deter crime? Could we help people develop the self-control to avoid some of the impulsive and abusive behaviors that they have through making cognitive behavioral therapy more widely available? Can we reduce the amount of lead in pipes and in other parts of the ambient environment, since that's been shown to correlate with violence, abuse, and crime, right? Can we have better street lighting so that winds up creating fewer situations where someone's in a dark environment where someone can take advantage of them, right? Can people leverage their existing social networks so as to more easily escape abusive relationships? Can we offer domestic violence shelters and other assistance to people who are escaping abusive relationships? And so the general way that I think about dealing with violence and abuse isn't sort of one single blueprint, but instead a question of, to what extent can social organization from the bottom up provide a variety of goods and services that help alleviate the harms of violence and interpersonal abuse and harm in society, and generate mechanisms for accountability and conflict resolution. And that's kind of a hand-wavy answer, right? It doesn't give you a specific piece of legislation that you can sign, but it shows the sort of direction that my thinking trends in. And so I'm open to the possibility that the criminal justice system might, given a set of feasibility constraints, turn out to be something that in some specific cases clears the threshold of the presumption against violence. But I think because of certain institutional incentives associated with the discretionary power of police, prosecutors, prison guards, ICE agents, Border Patrol agents, and so on, tends to generate incentives to move beyond just the best case scenario uses of force, just the situations that seem like they would be philosophically and ethically justified, right? It might be the case that some alternative set of institutional arrangements could do better, right? Thinking about, for instance, governmental police versus a mall's security guards, right? If the police force, especially say a national police force, abuse you, then it's not really clear that they have a incentive to correct their errors, especially under the current system. But if, for instance, a mall is hiring security guards, they do want security guards who are harsh enough to deter shoplifting, because if too much shoplifting happens, the mall goes out of business. But if they hire security guards who are beating their customers repeatedly, or sexually abusing their customers, or sending them to torture camps in El Salvador, right? At some point, people are going to say, I don't want to go to this mall anymore. And also, I'd probably want to sue them for violation of my rights. And since the mall doesn't have, qualified immunity, they're actually civilly liable. And so the question is, how can we move more enforcement activity into a sphere with those sorts of incentives, and less of that enforcement activity into a sphere with the kinds of incentives that, say, ICE agents have under the current regime?
We might need more Paul Blarts and fewer Colonel Lockjaws is basically the point, right?
Exactly.
So you've kind of covered some of this already, but could you say a bit more about the individualist anarchist society that you envision as best for allowing the emancipation of queer and trans people? You've talked about this some already, but what realistic measures could we take to get from here to this society? And are maybe more radical or socialist or other types of anarchist critics open to what you're advocating?
Absolutely. So the particular type of political philosophy that I advocate in this essay is individualist anarchism. And it's a form of individualist anarchism that we can trace back to some 19th century American thinkers. And so these are anarchist thinkers like Benjamin Tucker, Voltairine de Cleyre, Lysander Spooner, and Dyer Lum. And so these thinkers were part of a social movement that was both radically libertarian, radically inspired by classical liberalism, and part of the radical left. And so what do I mean by that? Well, in terms of their radical libertarianism, they thought that individuals have very strong rights that ought to be enforced, respected, and protected, including against state interference, right? And they opposed the existence of the state as such. They instead thought that the state tends to engage in invasion or aggression against the rights of individuals, and that protection from invasion or aggression ought to be organized on the basis of a set of voluntary contracts with people who can enter the sort of offering of a market for protective services, right? So radically libertarian in that sense favored freedom of competitive entry into any given market, and thought that markets were one important part of a flourishing society. They saw this as an extension of the classical liberal tradition. So Benjamin Tucker, who published an individualist anarchist journal called Liberty, described his position as consistent Manchesterism, which was a reference to the radical free traders like Cobden and Bright, who were based in Manchester, England. He also described himself as an unterrified Jeffersonian Democrat, right? So where Jefferson said that, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, Tucker's thought that if we really want to respect these rights, this actually cuts in a more radical direction than Jefferson's thought. So not only do we have a right of revolution against particular governments that are abusing these rights, but perhaps government as such abuses these rights. All right, so radically libertarian, radically liberal, but also I say radically leftist. And why is that? Well, Benjamin Tucker thought that a lot of the exploitation he saw around him, whether it was exploitation of workers by bosses or of tenants by landlords, was not a result of the operation of a free market that was going forward in the way it naturally would, absent state interference. Instead, he thought that this exploitation was a result of coercive state intervention, right? So he wrote of what he called the four monopolies: the money monopoly, the land monopoly, the tariff monopoly, and the patent monopoly. Now, of course, Americans today are certainly laboring under the tariff monopoly, more so than we have in a long time. We're seeing that when the government enacts tariffs, this protects domestic firms from competition in a manner that allows them to raise their prices, and it forces foreign firms to also raise their prices accordingly, because they have to directly pay tariffs on any goods that they export to us or that we import from them. And this enables domestic firms to raise their prices to match that. And so that's one sort of thing. And it also will therefore have certain effects on the labor market insofar as it reduces competition, because it might put workers in a monopsonistic position, right? The patent monopoly. A patent is a state-granted monopoly privilege, right? If I say I've invented this product and the state grants me a patent, then if somebody else starts to market a very similar or identical product, I can sue them and say, hey, you didn't get my permission to use the physical goods in your possession and arrange them in this way and sell them to willing buyers, right? That would ordinarily be just ordinary market activity, peaceable exchange. But if I own a patent, I get to say, hey, you need to pay me if you're going to produce a good that is similar enough to my good. And so that's a monopoly privilege. Now, it's a monopoly privilege that is granted in order to incentivize innovation. But as I argue in a paper with Otto Leto in the journal Public Choice, these incentives can also be countervailed or outweighed by the fact that intellectual property also raises the cost of engaging in iterative innovation, right? So if you're making an invention that builds on a prior innovation, it might be costlier for you to do so when there's fairly stringent intellectual property laws. So it's unclear whether existing intellectual property arrangements encourage innovation on net, and they generate these monopoly privileges that enable a certain degree of exploitative use of state-secured market power by a set of entrenched incumbent business interests, right? And so what Tucker and other individualist anarchists were hinting at here mirrors or anticipates a critique of political capitalism that's been launched by the public choice economist Randy Holcomb. And so Holcomb argues that economic elites and political elites engage in mutually beneficial bargaining with each other, what public choice economists call rent seeking, and that this creates a set of special privileges, and that these special privileges enable a set of private actors to exploit the public through the use of state violence. And so this was part of the critique that the individualist anarchists were mounting. The individualist anarchists were also big proponents of the abolitionist movement. So, for instance, Lysander Spooner was a radical abolitionist, was even to some extent involved in efforts to support John Brown wrote a essay called A Plan for the Abolition of Slavery, which advocated some pretty insurrectionary actions against slavery. He also wrote an essay called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. Voltairine de Cleyre was an early feminist, wrote a lot about harms associated with the existing system of marriage at the time and the level of patriarchal power that it vested in husbands, including the power to rape their wives without legal reprisal, right? And so she was a critic of this type of abuse in the intimate order, right? And we see similar types of sympathy with the labor movement at the time, right? Dyer Lum and Benjamin Tucker were proponents of the labor movement, but thought that in order to achieve the goals of the labor movement, again, you need to level these for monopolies and these other state-secured privileges that mean that there are fewer people entering the market to make offers to workers, and as a result, workers have fewer outside exit options and can then be paid less than they would be offered, and maybe work in worse conditions than would be offered on a genuinely free market. And so that's the sort of individualist anarchist tradition that I'm appealing to in this piece. And, you know, I've advocated this position for a long time. I've participated in various left-wing and broader anarchist social milieus and movements as an advocate of this position. And sometimes people are pretty sympathetic, sometimes they're unsympathetic. So some of the sympathies that people have is they recognize, okay, you share my interest in using prefigurative politics, that is, sort of be the change you want to see in the world, build alternative social arrangements outside the state in order to make the world a better place, and make the world a more egalitarian and free place. And so they see a complementarity in terms of chosen means and chosen ends, a world emancipated from rulership and oppression, right? A world where all people can be free and can relate to one another as dignified equals. So often they see that, especially if you're directly involved in some of the same work. For instance, if you're working together to support prisoners, or you're working together to oppose the operation of an ICE detention center in your community, or to challenge those who operate a for-profit prison company that contracts with the government to run ICE detention centers, or if you're advocating for jury nullification and educating the general public that they have the right to conscientiously acquit if they think that the law being applied in a case is unjust, as for instance it would be if it's a victimless crime, right? Or if you're getting together to write letters to prisoners, or you're getting together to offer food to people in public, you know, at zero price, as people involved in Food Not Bombs and other mutual aid organizations do, right? So when people see that you're walking the walk in these ways, they're often likely to be sympathetic, even if they have these technical economic disagreements with you. But there are still questions people have, right? People might worry, okay, you believe in property rights, and they think property rights are a mechanism by which the employers exploit the employed, right? Or by which landlords exploit tenants. And they think actually existing property is largely unjustly acquired and is a state-secured system of privileges, right? One of their big critiques of the police is that they protect property rather than people, right? And so that might be a point of tension, is on questions related to property rights, right? Now, I have critiques of many existing property rights because, you know, as Robert Nozick, for instance, acknowledged, right, a lot of existing property claims arise from things that didn't involve sort of initial just acquisition or voluntary transfer and exchange, right? There has been a history of colonialism, land theft, imperialism, violence, theft, and so slavery, right? And so I'm not saying that all existing property titles are valid, but I do think property serves a really important social function in terms of coordinating market exchange. So that's a point of tension with other anarchists and certainly with socialists on these matters. But I think the general means that I favor for moving towards an anarchist society, towards an individualist anarchist society, are ones related to people engaging in what the anthropologist David Graeber called defiant insistence on acting as if one is already free. That is direct action. Rather than just seeking permission from authority figures, people should ask, how can I interact with others in my community to build a better world, to build a world where people can have relations of care, of voluntary cooperation, and where all people are free and respected. And so that might mean mutual aid, it might mean supporting prisoners, offering jail support, it might mean engaging in social movements to oppose the worst manifestations of state violence or cronyism or concentrated power in your community. It might mean organizing community spaces that are supportive for people who are vulnerable, like undocumented immigrants or queer and trans people or survivors of sexual violence and domestic abuse, right? All of these things are things I'm favorable towards, and I think different people, depending on where they're socially situated, will have the relevant knowledge and experience to do some of these things. And so don't look at this as an all or nothing, I have to do things on this laundry list. Instead, I think you should meet your neighbors, you should try to forge social connections with other people, and you can ask yourself, well, what are the ways that I can meaningfully make the world a freer and more egalitarian place? And that, I think, is really the path forward towards individualist anarchism, that and educating people about the range of possibilities for social arrangements and the ethical problems with existing systems of domination, control, and state violence. And so it's a mix of education, direct action, and community building. And I think when you're engaged in that, you're likely to find yourself interacting with folks on the left. And if you're walking the walk, people are going to see that. And there might still be contentious conversations. There will definitely be people who don't like you. There are certainly people who don't like me. But you're likely to find at least some common ground in the room to find allies who share your interest in improving the world.
I have a really hard time believing there's people who don't like you, and that's their problem.
Well,
That's on them. Well, before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to mention about the chapter or any forthcoming work that you're doing?
Absolutely. So I definitely would encourage everyone to check out not just my chapter, but the entire book, Liberal Emancipations. So, not all of the book advocates a position as extreme as what I'm advocating in my chapter. So even if you listen to this conversation and thought, well, that's crazy, I promise you not all of the contributors to the volume are advocating something quite like this. So I would encourage you to check out the other chapters. And I would encourage you to, read my chapter with an open mind and ask, okay, if I disagree with the argument, where are the points of disagreement and where are the points of agreement? Because I think some people will read through it and they might find some points of agreement, some points of disagreement, and I hope that that can be constructive for people coming from a wide range of perspectives. In terms of forthcoming work, these days I'm largely focused on analyzing and critiquing the militarization of US border security and the threat that it poses to domestic civil liberties. And so I'm working on some papers on topics like the effect of immigration enforcement on families, the ways that existing immigration enforcement clashes with the rule of law, the ways that immigration enforcement has undermined the classical liberal values associated with the American founding and eroded constitutional constraints in the United States. And so you should definitely keep an eye out for some of that work. If you want to see a hint of where I'm going with that, I would encourage you to check out some papers that I published recently in the last couple of years, including Border Militarization and Domestic Institutions, which was published in the journal Constitutional Political Economy, Collective Action and in the Sanctuary Movement, which was co-authored with my colleagues Carla Segovia and Molly Ravinsky, and was published in the journal Constitutional Political Economy. And for ongoing updates on this line of research, as well as public commentary on issues related to border militarization, immigration enforcement, civil liberties, and self-governance, I'd encourage you to subscribe to my Substack, Guns, Guards, and Governance, which you can find at gunsguardsandgovernance.substack.com. You can also follow me on Twitter or X at Nathan P. Goodman, or on Blue Sky at nathanpgoodman.bsky.social. And if you do, feel free to say hi, whether through DMs or in replies, and maybe we can either have some vigorous contestation on the areas where we disagree, or find opportunities for mutual and complementary cooperation on issues where we find common ground. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll check out my work and other work that's focused on emancipatory liberalism and positive social change.
And we should be able to provide some of those relevant links. But Dr. Goodman, thank you for your insights.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Glod, and I appreciate the work that you and everyone at the Equal Freedom Institute is doing to advance liberalism as a force for equality, justice, and freedom for all people.
Great. Take care.
Thank you.
The Equal Freedom Institute is a grassroots think tank bringing together the next generation of liberal thought leaders, policymakers, and community organizers. If you want to see more programming like this, please make a donation at equalfreedom.org/donate. As a volunteer-led organization with no corporate or institutional backing, we urgently need your support. Liberals have a rare and real opportunity to roll back the spread of right-wing ideologies, but only if we act fast. As a 501c3 nonprofit, all donations to EFI are tax deductible. Join us at equalfreedom.org. And you can follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn.